13 forgotten brutal, foods people ate to survive history's darkest famines. You think famine victims only died quietly in the streets. Think again. When starvation stalked entire nations, people ate things that would make your stomach turn, your mind recoil, and your survival instincts question everything you thought you knew about humanity. These weren't recipes passed down with pride. These were desperate measures, last resorts, and horrifying choices that real people made to see one more sunrise. From the potato fields of Ireland to the siege walls of Leningrad, from the drought-scorched plains of China to the war-torn villages of Europe, hunger transformed human beings into creatures willing to consume absolutely anything. Let's descend into 13 brutal foods that starving populations actually ate during history's darkest famines. Foods that saved lives, destroyed souls, and revealed the terrifying lengths humans will go to survive. Warning, what you're about to hear isn't for the faint of heart. Grass soup. When the Irish potato famine hit in 1845, 1 million people didn't just disappear. They clawed for survival using everything the land still offered, and that meant grass. Not the manicured lawn variety, but wild grasses, weeds, and any green thing that hadn't already been stripped bare. Irish families would gather nettles, dandelions, wild mustard, even plain meadow grass, then boil them for hours into a thin, bitter liquid they called soup. It wasn't soup. It was green water with fibrous plant matter floating in it, so tough it couldn't be digested. People's mouths would turn green from eating it. Their stomachs would cramp and bloat because human digestive systems can't break down cellulose like cattle can. But it filled the gnawing emptiness for a few hours. Children cried from stomach pain while their parents forced down another bowl, knowing it was killing them slowly but hoping it would buy time until real food came. The grass stained their teeth, their tongues, their hopes. Survivors remembered the taste of desperation for the rest of their lives, that bitter, green, utterly useless flavor of trying to digest the earth itself. Sawdust bread. During the siege of Leningrad from 1941 to 1944, when Nazi forces encircled the city and cut off all supplies, Soviet citizens ate through everything edible in 6 months. Then they started eating things that weren't. Sawdust became a staple ingredient because it was everywhere in a city built on wood. Factory workers collected it by the bagful. Women would mix sawdust with any tiny amount of flour they could scrounge, maybe wallpaper paste for binding, a pinch of salt if they were lucky. The resulting bread looked like compressed dirt and tasted like the inside of a lumber mill mixed with glue. It had virtually no nutritional value. The wood fibers would tear up people's intestines on the way through. But it created the psychological sensation of eating bread, of having something solid in your stomach. Families would slice it thin and chew each piece slowly, pretending it was real food. Children were told it was a new kind of bread from the countryside. The truth. It was industrial waste mixed with desperation, baked into loaves that represented humanity's ability to lie to itself just to make it through one more day. Thousands died with sawdust still in their digestive systems. Leather soup when absolutely everything else was gone, people boiled their shoes. This happened during multiple famines, the Russian famine of 1921, the Ukrainian Holodomor of 1930-33, and repeatedly during the siege of Leningrad. The process was grotesque but methodical. First, you'd cut the leather into small strips. Boots worked best because they were thicker. Then you'd boil them for hours, sometimes days, trying to break down the tanned animal hide back into something your body might absorb. The water would turn brown and oily with whatever chemicals had been used in tanning. It smelled like a shoe factory mixed with rotten meat. Some people would add grass or tree bark to bulk it out. The leather never actually got soft enough to chew properly. You'd gnaw on rubbery strips until your jaw ached, then force them down. The soup was just hot water that tasted like industrial chemicals and desperation. But here's the horrifying truth. It sometimes worked. Leather is made from animal hide, which is protein. If you could get it down and keep it down, your body might extract something useful. People survived weeks on leather soup, but they never survived whole. The psychological damage of boiling your only pair of shoes and eating them while winter approached was its own kind of death. Tree bark bread in China's Great Famine from 1959 to 1961, caused by Mao's disastrous Great Leap Forward policies. An estimated 30 to 45 million people died. Before they died, they ate the trees, not the leaves, the bark. The inner bark specifically, the soft layer between the rough outer bark and the hard wood. Families would strip trees completely bare, leaving ghostly white trunks standing in fields like skeletal warnings. The bark would be dried, pounded into a rough powder, then mixed with whatever else existed, dirt, grass, ground-up roots, to form a substance that could be shaped into cakes and baked. It tasted like biting into a tree, because that's exactly what it was. Bitter, woody, impossible to swallow without water. It would swell up in your stomach, creating an agonizing sense of fullness while providing almost zero nutrition. People's digestive systems would shut down from trying to process wood fiber. But the psychological need to eat something, anything, drove entire villages to strip their landscapes bare. When visitors came to these areas after the famine ended, they found forests of dead, barkless trees standing as monuments to starvation. The trees had been murdered by hungry hands. If you're still watching this descent into humanity's darkest hours, hit that subscribe button. Understanding history's horrors helps us appreciate what we have and prevent them from happening again. Blood soup. During the Soviet famine of 1921-1922, which killed 5 million people, peasants in the Volga region developed a brutal survival strategy. They would bleed their animals without killing them. Horses, cows, even dogs, anything with blood. They'd open a vein, collect a cup or two of blood, then seal the wound and hope the animal survived to be bled again next week. The blood would be mixed with hot water, maybe a handful of milled grain if any existed, and consumed immediately before it coagulated. It tasted like hot iron, salty and thick, coating your throat on the way down. This was vampire survival food, except vampires in stories stayed elegant and powerful. Real people drinking blood soup were skeletal, desperate, and often vomiting it back up because their shrunken stomachs couldn't handle the richness. The animals would weaken with each bleeding, becoming less useful for work, producing less milk. Eventually, they'd die anyway, and then the family would eat them raw because there was no fuel left for cooking. Blood soup represented a horrifying calculation. Slowly kill your work animal to extend your own life by a few days, knowing you're destroying your future even as you try to survive the present. Clay cakes in multiple famines across Asia, Africa, and Europe, people ate dirt. Not accidentally, deliberately. They called them clay cakes or earth bread, and the practice has been documented in Armenia during the 1915 genocide, in China during the Great Famine, and in various African famines throughout the 20th century. People would collect specific types of clay, usually white or gray clay from riverbanks, mix it with water into a paste, then form small cakes and bake them until hard. Sometimes they'd mix in a tiny amount of grain or salt to make them slightly more palatable. The result was like eating chalk mixed with mud. It would coat your mouth, stick to your teeth, and sit in your stomach like a stone, because it was a stone. Clay has no nutritional value whatsoever, but it filled the terrible, consuming emptiness. It stopped the hunger pangs temporarily by physically filling space in your stomach. The cost? Severe constipation, intestinal blockages, and eventual death from malnutrition while feeling full. People died with pounds of clay compacted in their digestive systems, their final meal a geological formation. The cruelty was complete. They died of starvation while feeling like they'd eaten. Ditch water stew during the Bengal famine of 1943, which killed 3 million Indians while the British exported food from the region. Villagers made stew from drainage ditches. They would collect the water from irrigation channels, rice paddy drainage, anywhere water sat stagnant. This water was contaminated with everything: animal waste, decomposing plant matter, bacteria, parasites, probably human waste too. But it was wet and it came from agricultural areas, so maybe, just maybe, it had some nutrients from the soil. People would boil this water for hours, letting anything solid settle to the bottom, then drink the slightly clearer liquid from the top. Sometimes they'd add grass or leaves. The smell was like rotten vegetation mixed with sewage. The taste was death postponed, and it was full of cholera, dysentery, typhoid, every waterborne disease. Families would gather around these stews knowing they might die from disease tomorrow, but they'd definitely die from dehydration today. Children went first because their bodies couldn't fight off the infections. Parents would watch their children die from the water they'd served them, knowing they'd made the only choice available. This wasn't food. This was choosing which way you'd prefer to die, fried rats. When Leningrad's food supplies completely vanished, the city's rat population became a delicacy. People set traps, hunted them in basements and sewers, even raised them if they could. A good-sized rat could feed a person for a day, maybe two if you stretched it. The preparation was simple because there was no fuel to waste. Skin it, gut it, fry it in whatever fat you might have saved, or just roast it over a small fire. Rat meat is dark, gamey, and surprisingly tough for such a small animal. It tastes like what it ate, which in Leningrad meant garbage, glue, and other rats. But it was actual protein, real meat. Famine survivors spoke about fried rat with the same nostalgia other people reserve for holiday meals because compared to sawdust bread and leather soup, rat was a feast. The psychological barrier was enormous. These were sewer rats, disease carriers, things you'd normally poison. But hunger has a way of redrawing every line you thought you'd never cross. By 1942, Leningrad's rat population had been hunted nearly to extinction. When the rats were gone, people knew they were truly doomed. The rats had been the last buffer between survival and the absolute worst option: bone meal porridge. Throughout multiple famines, people would collect old bones from any source: graveyards, abandoned battlefields, garbage heaps, animal carcasses that had been picked clean months earlier. These bones would be crushed into powder using rocks or whatever tools remained. The resulting bone meal would be mixed with water and boiled into a thin porridge. This actually had some nutritional logic. Bones contain calcium, phosphorus, and small amounts of protein and fat locked in the marrow. But by the time famine victims were grinding up old bones, most nutrients were long gone. What remained was mostly mineral content that human bodies can barely absorb. The porridge tasted like dirt mixed with bitter chalk, with a disturbing undertone of wherever those bones came from. If they were human bones, and in the worst famines they sometimes were, nobody asked questions. Nobody wanted to know. You just ate what you called bone meal porridge and tried not to think about the grandmother, the soldier, or the child those bones might have been. This food represented complete breakdown of society, of taboos, of the thin line between human and animal survival instincts. Weed cakes during North Korea's famine of the 1990s, which killed hundreds of thousands. People made cakes from wild plants that were normally considered poisonous, or at least inedible. Plants like shepherd's purse, mugwort, and various root weeds that grew in ditches and fields. The key was preparation, boiling them multiple times, changing the water to try to leach out toxins, then mashing them into a paste. Sometimes cornmeal or rice flour would stretch them if any grain existed. The resulting cakes were green-brown, smelled like composting vegetation, and tasted aggressively bitter. Your mouth would pucker and your throat would try to reject them, but they were something. People's faces would swell up from the toxins. Their skin would turn slightly yellow, but they lived a few more days. Children refused to eat them until they were physically forced. The cakes represented a parent's worst nightmare, feeding your child poison because it was better than watching them starve. Today, North Korean defectors still can't look at certain plants without feeling nauseous, their bodies remembering what their minds try to forget. Cottonseed mash in China's Great Famine, after everything edible was gone, people turned to cottonseed, the seed pods left over from cotton production. Normally, cottonseed is processed carefully for industrial use or animal feed because it contains gossypol, a toxic compound that causes heart damage and reproductive failure in humans. Starving peasants didn't have processing facilities. They would pound the seeds into a rough meal, mix it with water, and eat it as porridge. The immediate effects were awful: vomiting, diarrhea, dizziness. The long-term effects were worse: heart problems, infertility, liver damage. But it filled stomachs, it provided some calories. It kept you alive until next week. Maybe. Villages that relied heavily on cottonseed mash saw fertility rates plummet for years after the famine ended. Men became permanently sterile. Women miscarried or gave birth to children with severe defects. The cottonseed didn't just steal the present, it stole the future. Survivors called it the devil's grain, food that saved your life while killing everything that made life worth living. Boiled clothing when leather shoes were gone, people boiled their fabric clothing. Wool coats, cotton shirts, even the stuffing from old mattresses. These would be cut into pieces, boiled for hours to soften, then either consumed as a fibrous mush or the liquid would be drunk as broth. This happened in Leningrad, in the Ukraine, in besieged cities across World War II. The logic was desperate. Cloth is made from organic materials, cotton from plants, wool from animals. Maybe if you broke it down enough, your body could extract something. It couldn't. Fabric is processed beyond recognition. The chemicals used in dyeing and treating cloth are toxic. People would get violently ill from the dyes alone. But the alternative was eating nothing, and nothing is certain death. So they boiled their winter coats and drank the purple water from their dyed wool, knowing they were poisoning themselves, but hoping the calories from the wool fat might balance out the toxins. When you're eating your clothing, you've crossed into territory beyond famine. You're consuming your own civilization, one thread at a time. The unspeakable last resort. There's one brutal food we haven't mentioned, the one that appeared in nearly every major famine when absolutely everything else failed. Cannibalism. During the Leningrad siege, the Ukrainian Holodomor, China's Great Famine, and others, when people had eaten the grass, the bark, the leather, and the rats, some turned to the bodies of those who had already died. Sometimes it was the recently dead. Sometimes it wasn't. Police records from these periods are filled with horrifying cases. Parents who disappeared, children who went missing, neighbors who suddenly had meat. This wasn't the survival cannibalism of plane crash victims making an impossible choice. This was famine cannibalism, sometimes predatory, creating a final nightmare layer where starvation combined with the fear of being eaten. We don't glorify it or detail it because it represents the absolute bottom of human experience. But it's part of this dark history, the final brutal food, that proves when hunger becomes extreme enough, every human boundary can collapse. These 13 foods represent humanity's darkest hours, when civilization's veneer stripped away and survival became the only law. They remind us that famine isn't a gentle fading away. It's brutal, degrading, and transforms people into versions of themselves they never imagined possible. Today, we have enough food on this planet to feed everyone. Every death from starvation is a choice we make as a species. Remember these brutal foods not with fascination, but with determination that they remain history, not prophecy.